If you are still coming in, you are in the webinar Innovation for Vocation, hosted by Pree Center. So if this is where you intend to be, you're in the right place, and we're glad you're here. Do me a favor as you enter and drop in the chat just your name and where you're from. Where in the world are you joining us from today? Drop those in and we'll start to collect those. Hi, Greg. Good to see you. Bethany, everybody else, great, welcome. Well, again, okay, so I am Michaela O'Donnell Long, and I'm the Senior Director at the Pree Center, and this is the webinar Innovation for Vocation with our special guest, Scott Cormode, who I'll tell you about in just a second. But even before we do that, I want to give a giant thank you to the Koinonia Network for co-sponsoring this and for helping us get the word out. If you don't know about the Koinonia Network, my colleague Paul will drop the link in the chat for you to see. But they're a learning community of theological educators that are really helping advance the conversation and equip disciples on the subject of faith work, economics, and vocation. So check them out, and we're grateful for their partnership in this event. And we are the Pree Center, the Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, where we really help leaders make sense of their biggest questions in all the seasons of God's calling in their life. And as part of that work, we do many things. We have a daily devotional that goes out. We have online classes and resources. We have cohorts, and we have these webinars that are sort of learning opportunities for you to hear from some of our best thinkers and people who are putting out new research and new resources on topics that are important, especially in this moment, which is why I'm excited to have Scott Cormode with us today. Scott Cormode is the Hugh Dupree Professor for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Dupree Center. And close to my heart, he was my academic mentor as I went through the process of getting a PhD in what was only a couple of years ago, but somehow feels maybe like I blocked it out and put it into a longer time. So I know firsthand what a treat it is to listen to Scott and to learn from him. So I'm delighted for you all to have that experience today. And sort of key in this moment, Scott has a brand new book out, and that book is called The Innovative Church. And if you were one of the lucky, there it is right there in all its glory, thank you. If you're one of the lucky people to be first to sign up for this, you will have already gotten your copy digitally. And if you're not, if you did not receive one, there is a link to be able to buy it that'll be dropped in the chat right now. And today we have Scott really to talk about all of the work and all of the learning and all the years of expertise that went into that book. How does that apply specifically to the topic of vocation? As we all know, the world of work has changed drastically in the last couple of decades, and maybe even exponentially more drastically this year in 2020. So it's a great time to be asking questions about vocation. How does it matter? What does it mean? Some of these big core questions in light of this changing landscape. So what we'll do is we'll have Scott will sort of give us his vision for vocation and talk us through that. Along the way, if you have any questions, and in fact, we encourage you to ask questions. Scott loves questions, I know this. Drop them in the Q&A, and we'll sort of break at different intervals to go after those questions. So just as they come up, don't feel like you need to hold them, but whenever you have a question for Scott, just drop it straight over into the Q&A. And I think with that, Scott, I'm going to pass the mic over to you and let you get us going on vocation.
Thanks a lot, Michaela. It's an honor to be here. I am deeply connected to the Dupree Leadership Center. And let's put it this way, I am only at Fuller because of the work that the Dupree Leadership Center did to prepare the way for me. So I am deeply grateful to be able to do anything I can with them. So today we are going to be talking about innovation for vocation. And that requires us really to have three separate conversations all at the same time. And so what I'm going to do is partition those out a little bit, because it's hard to have three separate conversations at the same time. We want to have a conversation about innovation, how we need to change. We want to have a conversation about vocation, and we want to talk about callings in the world. And each of those is related to the other conversations. And it would be very easy for us to get so caught up in trying to have all the conversations at once that we would lose them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking to you about what I mean by innovation. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a break and see what people want to say. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what I mean by vocation, and then take a little bit of a break and see what people want to say, and we can get questions. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see this as related to callings in the out in the marketplace, out in the world. And so that's kind of the three parts of the conversation that we're going to have today. Let me start by simply talking to you about what do I mean by innovation. My book starts with this this clear idea: the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. The church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. That creates that creates a need for us to do innovation. We have to figure out, how do we innovate our way forward? The problem with that is that when you read all the literature on innovation, one of the things that you're going to find is that over and over again, the literature on innovation says the same thing. It says the best way to innovate your way forward is to abandon the past. Now, the problem is we can never abandon the past. If we abandon the past, we will have to stop talking about Jesus as Lord. We have to abandon the past. We'll have to stop talking about reading 2 Corinthians. We will never stop reading 2 Corinthians. We will never stop saying Jesus is Lord. We will never stop saying love your neighbor as yourself. So what does it mean to innovate our way forward when our identity, the things that matter most to us, our legitimacy is tied with continuity with the past? So here's the way that I would describe it. The question at the heart of my book, the question at the heart of all Christian innovation is this: how do we maintain a rock solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel, while at the same time create an entrepreneurial or innovative spirit for the way in which we present that gospel to an ever-changing culture? In other words, how do we live with both an unchanging gospel and an ever-changing culture? I'm going to argue that the way that we do that is by reinventing Christian practices, by taking Christian practices, and I don't mean just any Christian practices. I mean the kinds of Christian practices that are what we might call constitutive practices. Constitutive practices are those that constitute the faith, the kinds of practices that there has never been a time or a place in all of Christian history where those practices weren't engaged. We've always engaged in those practices. One of them is calling and vocation. We've always had calling in the world. So when we talk about calling and vocation in a minute, that will be one of the constitutive practices. But I'm going to argue that we need to reinvent practices. So in a moment, you're going to ask me, well, what do you mean by reinventing practices? Let me give you an example. I think, for example, we need to revisit our understanding of the term Sabbath. There's never been a time or a place where there have been Christians who didn't talk about Sabbath. And we've typically defined Sabbath in our culture as a day of rest. And if you are the Hebrews who are enslaved by Pharaoh and you are working 365 days a year, then yes, you need a day of rest. But I would argue that instead, we need to think of Sabbath as a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. I think we need to redefine Sabbath to talk about a healthy rhythm of labor and rest, because I think learning to labor well is as important as learning how to rest well. And for our particular culture, we often have things, well, what I would describe as, well, do you know what I mean by junk food eating? If we all want to be engaged in healthy eating, but we all know what junk food is. It's food, it gives us calories, but it really doesn't, it's not healthy. I would argue as well that we have something that we might call junk food labor and junk food rest. Junk food labor is the kind of thing where we're procrastinating. We're kind of thinking we're working, we're kind of not working. You know, you all know what junk food labor is. Junk food rest is the kind of thing where we are absence of work, but it is not restorative. For me, that looks like flipping channels on the TV, just looking for something, but really not resting well. We need to learn how to get a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. And that means that we have to get beyond junk food labor and junk food rest. That's what I mean by innovation. Innovation is going to help us. Innovation is going to happen when we can create new mental models for understanding the constitutive practices that define the church. Now, you're going to ask me, how might we go about that? I've defined 5 questions that it will help us think through innovation. I'm playing off of here what Peter Drucker once did, where he was asked how to understand healthy organizations. And he gave a list of 5 questions that every organization needed to answer. And what's nice about having questions instead of answers is they allow every community to contextualize them for their particular social location. And what are the 5 questions that I would like to say define Christian innovation? If you want to engage in Christian innovation, you engage these 5 questions. The first one is this: who are the people entrusted to your care? I would argue that Christian leaders don't have followers. Jesus had followers. Christian leaders don't have followers. Christian leaders have people entrusted to their care. So, who are the people entrusted to your care? The second question is, what are the longings and losses that those people feel? What I mean by that is the things that keep people awake at night, the things that are true of the human condition. Every one of us experience longings and losses that are just part of being human. I would argue that we need to know the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care if we are going to lead them from a Christian perspective. Third question is, what are the big lies that your people believe that prevent them from hearing the gospel? For example, when I think of big lies, one of the things that I think is a big lie that the church often believes is not doing bad things makes up for not doing good things. That's the Pharisees' answer. The Pharisees' answer to what does it mean to be a Christian, or what does it mean to be a follower of God, would be to say, there's a list of things we are not going to do. And Jesus came along and said, no, I'm afraid that's not good enough. You need to have a whole list of things that you are going to do. But the Pharisees believed that if I didn't do bad things, that makes up for not doing good things. We in the church look around, I see that big lie everywhere. So there's lots of big lies that we believe. The fourth question is, how do we make spiritual sense of those longings and losses? Because ultimately our job is to help people see things from Christ's perspective, to see things as God sees them, to see them as a world that is narrated by Christian categories. We'll talk a moment about how to see vocation in that way. And then the fifth question is, how do we express those longings and losses? How do we express that making spiritual sense as what I call shared stories of future hope? We need to create shared stories. We need to take your story and my story and weave it together with the biblical story to create a shared story of future hope. So in a moment, I'm going to pause and ask if there's any questions. So I'm going to encourage those of you who are thinking for questions to put them into the chat right now. And Michaela will sort through them and either ask me a question of her own or ask me one of those questions. But I want you to see that what happens with these 5 questions is that they have a progression. They add up to an answer to the question of how do we build a rock-solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel, and at the same time create an entrepreneurial spirit for how we present that gospel to an ever-changing culture. The answer is that we create shared stories of future hope that make spiritual sense of the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. We engage in Christian innovation by creating shared stories of future hope that make spiritual sense of the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. So, Michaela, I'm going to turn to you and ask, I've not been monitoring the chat. Are there questions that may or may not have come up?
Yes, so we'll sort of let some of those come in, and I'm going to take the liberty and sort of take the mic as the person who has it and ask my own question first. Scott, I love this. I think it's very, very helpful. It's a framework for, people entrusted to our care, understanding their longings and losses, the big lies that maybe they're trapped in, and how to make spiritual sense of that, and then how do we actually express that. So immediately I go to more of the like, how do we do that? And the question I want to ask you is, as you've been working with people, have you noticed that there are certain obstacles that get in people's way, and there are certain things that hold them back? And by sort of attuning specifically to those, they can kind of move from stuck to unstuck in this process.
Sure. So one of the things that scholars will tell you is that people walk around making decisions based on mental models. And what happens is adopting certain mental models creates a tendency to get stuck. For example, a mental model of scarcity. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, likes to talk about how what we have are myths of scarcity and liturgies of abundance. We think that we receive God's abundant life and we experience it as scarcity. That's the kind of thing. Now, I'm also looking and seeing that there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to just jump to those if that's okay. One of them is, how do you distinguish between relevance and conformance to the world? This comes from Benjamin. When the agenda that we take is not based on relevance or conformity, what I'm thinking of is the things that are intrinsic to what it means to be human. Those are the longings and losses. I would argue that the gospel is Jesus's response to the human condition. There are ways in which it is difficult to live life, regardless of wherever you are, that every human encounters. Let me give you an example of one. I was just talking to some of my students an hour ago about this idea of individuation. When you are a young person, when you're 5 years old, your identity is solely wrapped up in your family. By the time you're 50, you are an individual. The process of becoming an individual is this individuation process. And that process is both liberating and painful. Because as a young person, I gain freedom, but I also have to accept responsibility. And as a parent, I allow my young person gains independence, which I want, but they lose control. But as a parent, I lose control. So for both parent and child, we live in a situation that is just intrinsic to every family. Every family experiences individuation. It is difficult for every family. It is the way things are. What does the gospel say to a parent that is in the midst of an individuation process? What does the gospel say in that kind of a moment? Or let's think about labor. Every one of us works on our own, and every one of us works with people. That there is a joy of working with people. And in case you may not have noticed, sometimes people can be a pain. So there's joy in people, there's pain in people. That is not true of only some people. That is true of all people in all places, that they experience labor as being difficult and joyful because of the people that they encounter. Those are the kinds of things that we need to speak to. That's not pandering to some kind of conformity to the world. These are things that every human being encounters. And because every human being encounters, the gospel must speak to that.
Scott, we have some really good questions coming in the chat. Look, there's a couple about context. One is sort of like, depending on the size of your group, like how actually like do you discover? How do you listen to longings and losses? And I think tagged onto that one, are there big universal like lies, or is that a contextual thing that a leader sort of has to go and discover for him or herself?
I love those questions. Now, one of them is how do you listen well? Now, this is one of those moments when you have made the mistake of asking an author to talk about his book, and so I have this giant temptation to go off and give you a long answer, but instead I'm going to have to say, because our time is limited, I'm going to point you back to the book. Chapter 3 of the book is about listening. Those of you who know me know that one of the things I say over and over again is leadership begins with listening. And in this chapter on called Leadership Begins with Listening, we ask 3 questions. Who do we listen to? What do we listen for? And how do we listen well? And we're going to talk through, the chapter talks through all 3 of those. I don't I don't have time to do justice to those three questions, but that's as much as I can say about that for right now. But as far as the contextualized question about, are there big lies that are universals? I think there are big lies that are common to cultures. So for example, uh, have any of you ever been shopping? Have you ever gone to a mall or a store? In the Western context, there are a number of lies that are built into stores. For example, I used to work in retail, and one of the things that they taught us in retail is the customer is always right. Now, it turns out that's not really true, but we've adopted that in retail. One of the things that happens, though, is that when we go into a retail setting, we tend to adopt the idea that I, as the customer, am always right, even if I'm not. And so there's a big lie that's been propagated onto us. Another one like that is that when I encounter somebody in commerce, I am encountering a role, not a human being. Let me give you an example. I have AT&T internet, and we had an internet problem last summer. And it took me 10 phone calls back and forth with AT&T to get this resolved. And after phone call about 8, I'm talking to some poor guy who's the first time I've talked to him. And I'm just exasperated. And I realize that I'm being short with him. I'm being angry at him. He didn't do this. This is just, he doesn't know that he's number 8 on the, but in my mind, he is not a human being anymore. He is a representative of a company that has done me wrong. And so I stopped seeing him as a human being as God would see him and treated him only in his role. That is a big lie that we are taught in our society that is an acceptable big lie that you're allowed to do. You're allowed to forget that people are human beings and just treat them based on their role.
It's really helpful. Scott, can I do one more from this section before you go on? Because I think you're really
Sure.
going to like this question. Okay, I'm going to read it. It's from Lisa. It starts with the Drucker, which is why I'm giving it to you. Drucker said that the primary discipline of innovation, oh, now it's moving, is abandonment. And as you said, we cannot abandon the primary truths of the gospel and the Christian faith. But there are quite a number of things that the Christians and the church must abandon that no longer serve us. What is the process for abandonment?
Oh, you're right. I love that question. Because you fully get what the dilemma of us is. If the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists, the first thing we have to abandon is our attachment to a world that is not here anymore. So we have designed so many of our processes to answer questions that people are not asking in that way anymore. And over again, as the church, we want to tell them, oh, well, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking the question the way that it was asked 30 years ago, rather than adopt. So one of the things we have to give up is our attachment to the old way of asking questions. But the second thing we have to give up is the mental models that allow us to say that we have understood the gospel to mean one thing, when in fact it doesn't. Let me give you an example. Chapter 2 of the book is all about how we understand innovation. What is our understanding of innovation? And it opens with a discussion of a man named Ralph Winter. Ralph Winter is, well, he was a professor at Fuller, so of course I'm going to celebrate him. But in 1973, he was a missiologist who stood in front of the greatest assembly of missionaries in history. And all those missionaries were asking this question: is the era of missions over? And they were asking it because everybody knew that the purpose of the gospel, or of the Great Commission, was to bring the gospel to every nation. And there was one group of people that said, yes, the era of missions is over because the gospel is now in every nation. And we should hand it over to the indigenous Christians. There was another group of people that says, yes, the gospel is in every nation, but we cannot abandon the people that are entrusted to our care any more than the Apostle Paul could have abandoned the Corinthians. And so his job was to answer that question. And he stood up to you and said, I'm sorry, you're both wrong, because you have misunderstood the word nation. You think the word nation means a nation state with borders and governments. But when we look at the scripture, the word is ethne. What it means is cultural groups. And that within the nation, for example, of India, you might have hundreds and thousands of different cultural groups. And yes, the gospel has gone to one nation, India, but it's not gone to all the cultural groups that are there. So what we have to abandon is our mental models that are tied to misunderstandings of what Scripture has to say. I'll give you one other quick example. The entire Reformation, you probably heard about the Reformation. It was in all the papers. The entire Reformation is built on Martin Luther rereading the gospel, or excuse me, the book of Romans, and saying, we have misunderstood what it means to say Jesus died for our sin. Jesus died for my sins. And he didn't say we need to stop saying Jesus died for my sins. He said we need a new understanding of that. We need to abandon our old understanding of it that tied it to hierarchies and churches and arbiters of priests, and instead adopt something that's much more close to what the biblical model says. So that's what I would say when I say that there is something that we need to abandon. So I want to go, we haven't actually talked about vocation yet. The whole point of this was innovation for vocation. How then do we understand vocation? So I want to point back to historically how scholars have talked about vocation. We just mentioned Martin Luther. One of the things Martin Luther talked about is that the essence of Christianity is love God, love your neighbor. None of us are going to argue with that. Jesus is on his side. You get Martin Luther and Jesus on the same side, we're all going to agree. But what Martin Luther would say is calling and vocation, what it means is loving your neighbor wherever you are planted. So if you happen to be planted in an office cubicle, then that's where you love your neighbor. If you happen to be planted in a farm, that's where you love your neighbor. If you are in a delivery service, that's where you love your neighbor. So many of these things are about vocation is about enacting neighbor love wherever you are called. So the question becomes, how would you do that? So I would argue that you go through the questions that I just talked about. And I would specifically say that vocation is about ultimately asking, who are the people entrusted to your care? Because most of us have read all of the stuff on calling and vocation that says that the most important thing to answer about your vocation is, what are your passions and what are your plans? And how can God use those passions and plans to serve God in the world? I would argue that vocation does not happen when God gives you passion. Vocation does not happen when God gives you plans. Vocation happens when God gives you a people entrusted to your care. Let me give you an example. There is a woman named Gina, who's a computer programmer. And in the cubicle next to her, there is a young man named Tran. Tran is the daughter of immigrants, the son of immigrants. And as the son of immigrants, his parents worked very, very hard, and it sacrificed a lot to get him to where he was today. He's gotten to the point where he's got a job. He's very happy about the fact that he has accomplished these things. And at the same time, he's really sad because the job takes a lot of time, and he's very lonely being far away from his family and friends. Now, the question is, who are the people entrusted to Gina's care? One of the people entrusted to Gina's care is Tran, this guy that sits across the cubicle from her. And one of the things that happens in the course of conversation is that Gina is able to tell him about the love of Jesus and about how Jesus came to live and die and rise again that he might have life. Now, what happens in this moment? What happens if Tran turns to her and says, I like this Jesus guy, but I don't like this idea of death. All that says, the death of Jesus, that just sounds kind of scandalous. It kind of morbid. Can we talk about a gospel that doesn't really involve death or scandal? And this is where Christian innovation has to be different than secular innovation. If you were a secular innovator and you would listen to your audience and your audience told you that death was something that was not palatable, you would then create a gospel that no longer needed to talk about the death of Jesus. We can't do that. We are inextricably and happily tied to the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. So instead, what we have to do is find a way to communicate to Tran the ways in which that gospel is good news. And finding a way to create a shared story of future hope that invites that Tran into that gospel. That's part of what Gina would have to do. Now, let me give you one other example of ways in which people entrusted to your care. I'll point to a guy named Michael, who was a store manager of a large big box drugstore. And when I talked to him, he would describe his work as a calling. And why would he describe his work as a calling? Because he would talk about the 19-year-olds that came to work for him. These people that hadn't really learned how to do things like show up on time or do good work or pay attention to the needs of the customers and put them ahead of their own, or look for things to do when you don't have any obvious thing to do. And he talked about how shaping these people, he said, I give them skills that they will use for the rest of their life. And he said, it happens that the drugstore that he serves happens to be right next to a very large retirement community here in Southern California. And so what happens is, well, before COVID, what would regularly happen is a lot of times the high point of some of these senior citizens' day was they would make the pilgrimage and walk across the parking lot and come and pick something up at their drugstore. He said, I know that they're coming here just to pick something up, but mostly they're coming to get out. And so I would teach my employees to engage them in conversation, get to know their names, be with them, serve them. He said, that's the way in which my job is a calling. Now, it turns out that making his job a calling made him a really good store manager. And they kept promoting him to bigger and bigger stores because the people that he trained were qualitatively different than the people that worked in other stores, because he saw he saw his work as a calling and he saw their work as a calling. That's what I mean when I say vocation is about the people entrusted to your care. But I want to say one more thing about vocation. Sometimes this idea of calling, this idea of people entrusted to your care, means that you need to become something you did not intend to be. Let me give you an example. God gave me daughters. I have 2 daughters. I have a wife. I live in a family of girls. And one of my favorite activities is I love to play basketball. Up until COVID, I still played 2 or 3 times a week, even as an old man. And I just happened to marry a woman who was tall. She's 5'10", and she's the shortest person in her family. And so for the longest time, I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to have daughters who are going to play basketball. I can picture teaching them. This is going to be wonderful. And the time that my daughters got to be about 3 years old, they looked at me and they looked at their mommy and they said, Mommy's way more interesting. We're going to be like her. And they have no interest in basketball. What are they interested in instead? They're interested in food. They're interested in fashion. They're interested in science. My wife's a computer programmer. My daughters grew up to be, one's in med school, the other's a physicist. They looked at mommy and they said, we love this idea of clothing and fashion. We love this idea of cooking. So when we talk on the phone, we talk about color and we talk about fabrics and we talk about food. But here's the thing. I had to decide, what am I going to do with that? So I can participate in a conversation about A-line skirts or A-line dresses, or I can talk about pencil skirts, or I can talk about ruched sleeves. I can tell you about the wonders of Addy Turbo knitting needles. I can talk about 7 different kinds of white as we're looking at how to talk about the paint on the wall. I had to decide, am I in on these conversations or am I out? I have no passion whatsoever for fabric or color or any of this, but I'm passionate about my daughters. And so I had to adopt the kinds of interests that the people entrusted to my care have. I had to become something, if I had followed my passions and my plans, I would have tried to force my daughters to learn basketball. Instead, I had to follow my daughters to what they cared about and become the dad that they needed me to be. That's what it means to be vocation. That was what it means to have a calling. So I'm going to pause there and I'm going to turn to Michaela and say, you've been monitoring all these questions. What would people like to say?
Yeah, so let me invite you all to start asking questions specifically about that section. I'm going to rephrase something you said, Scott, and then lead to a question from Bruce. It's actually a pretty provocative statement to say vocation does not happen when God gives you passion or plans, but instead a people entrusted to your care. That, I really want us to sit with that because of how provocative it is. It's certainly much less me focused and much more other people focused, which isn't necessarily, at least here in the United States, the message that is sort of permeating about work and about jobs and how we ought to do that. And look at Bruce's question, which is about, really the magnitude of people that are sometimes entrusted to our care. Both, it looks like, Bruce, you work in a church, both in the church and then also outside the church. And Scott, you're really talking about a way of moving through the world. And Bruce is asking, like, how do we think about doing that with all of those people? Can you talk to that a bit?
So the more responsibility you have, the more it takes more people than you to accomplish your goals. So, for example, I was talking to a pastor of a church and was talking to him about, it's about a 700 member church. And I was talking to him about the importance of understanding the longings and losses of the people entrusted to his care. And he said, "Oh yeah, I farm that out. I have other people who listen for me." And I get that. There's a certain level at which it's totally appropriate to say that, yes, other people need to engage in listening. But one of the things I told him is that you then have to find a way to either do your own listening as well, or listen deeply to the stories that people collect. Because if you don't collect the stories, if you don't pay attention to the longings and losses of your people, all you can do is treat your people as a stereotype. All you can do is assume that they are either a projection of you and the people you know, or some kind of other stereotype that I can judge them by what I see. So you have to engage in listening. Now, his response to that is, "I don't have time for that. God called me to preach and to teach, and I just don't have time to listen to people." And I said, "I don't think you have time not to listen to people, because your preaching and teaching is designed to land with a people. It cannot land with a people if you don't know the experiences that they have. Your preaching and teaching is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. How do you recalibrate your preaching and teaching? It's got to be through listening to what the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care." One other thing that you just said, Michaela, is about how provocative it is to say, calling is not about, vocation is not about your passions or your plans, but it's about a people entrusted to your care. Earlier, somebody asked me, are there big lies that I see permeating out there? One of the big lies is that God gives me callings that are about my passions and about my plans. And I regularly encounter young people in their 20s will say to me, "God gave me a calling. And what that means is I won't have to do any work I don't want to do. That I have been called to this particular thing." And I would say to them, the thing you describe you're called to, that's not an entry-level position. You're going to have to work for 10 years at entry-level and menial jobs to be qualified to eventually do this thing that God's called you to do. And it's going to take you 10 years of work to get there. And that's not God creating a false situation where he's not answered what he said. That's the process you need to go through. You have adopted a big lie that says, because I'm passionate about something, I don't have to do anything else. Other questions you might have for me?
Yeah, that's really good. It's certainly, and just that path of self-actualization and work as a means to that. I'm glad that you're sort of coming against that. I really like Jennifer's question, which is sort of the other side of the people entrusted to your care. Jennifer says, like, that sounds great. I agree. I'm picturing now your daughters. Sometimes people really are put in our care. But how do we know when we're called to go out and find the lost sheep that might not be like immediately in our reach or sort of currently entrusted to our care?
I love that question, because here's what you're asking. You are asking, who is my neighbor? You are asking, who are the people? That's why the first question is, who are the people entrusted to our care? It is not obvious to just simply, so for example, if you are a congregation, I am not willing to say that the people entrusted to my care are only the people that presently live in my church or presently come to my church. I would argue that we serve a missionary God who is constantly going out into the world, calling people to God's self. And I would like to suggest that we must, in the same way, be constantly going out into the world and calling people to God, to see God in the world. But how do you know which ones? That's what discernment is all about. That's why you live in community. I think it's very hard for me to decide on my own what God is calling me to do and where but I will tell you this, if it feels comfortable that I'm only serving the people that I want to serve, I have probably missed the boat. Because almost everybody I read in scripture, almost everyone I see in Christian history that is doing what they're called to do is constantly going beyond who they really want to serve and go to the people that are even the next stage out. I would argue that one of the Christian practices that we need to reinvent is the Christian practice of hospitality. We have this really um, tepid understanding of hospitality as a potluck, as serving a meal to our friends. I would argue that the Christian concept of hospitality is deeply tied to the idea of koinonia. But the Christian idea of hospitality is to treat outsiders like they are insiders. It is to extend privilege across difference. Now, you're going to ask me how to do that. I would be glad to talk to you. I've got a whole section in the book about exactly what that looks like. But there's no way to practice extending privilege across difference if you are only working with insiders. And I would argue that hospitality of that kind is constitutive. It is part of what it means to be a Christian church. You can't be Christian and not be engaged in that kind of hospitality. One more question before I go on?
Yeah, this is a good question. I have my own bias in my mind as I will read it. And that at the Dupree Center, we have, of course, right? We all have our own bias in our mind. But at the Dupree Center, we're currently running a bunch of groups that are helping people in these like stuck moments of vocation. And so this question, like I hear a lot of versions of it. And I'm picturing people who might be in a church, but might be in all kinds of industries across America. I'm thinking about the statistics that sometimes they're as high as like 79% of people don't like their job. And this question is, if my interests and passions are dramatically different from the people that God seems to have entrusted to my care, is that ever a reason to question my vocation? And then I'll add in Michaela's, or think about changing jobs and how do those relate? Then they said, just gave one example, which I think is helpful. For example, if I struggle to connect with them or even pray for them. And so just, can you talk a bit about when we feel disconnected from the people entrusted to our care?
So what you're really asking is, how do I know the people entrusted to my care are the people entrusted to my care? You know, how do I know that the people that are around me are those? Because if you absolutely for sure knew that these were the people entrusted to your care, you would think, okay, I just must. So for example, I wouldn't get to say, what do I do if one of my children is somebody I just don't connect with? Can I abandon that child and just focus on the children I like? We would never say that, because we are absolutely positively certain that God has entrusted these children to us. So what you're really asking is, how do I know these are the people entrusted to my care? And I want to separate your question. Your question is, what happens when I struggle to connect with them, and what happens when I struggle to pray for them? I can understanding struggle to connect with them because, well, that connection is a two-way thing. But struggling to pray for them, I mean, no matter what no matter who these people are, even if they are people that I strongly disagree with. I'm picturing my wife at one point had a boss's boss who we still remember his name, because he was, if you made a list of all the things you are not looking for in a boss, he would be this guy. One of the things that he would regularly do is shout and scold at people in public because he was wrong himself. Those kinds of things. But she could pray for him. She could pray for any of us. You could pray for the people entrusted to your care, and you can talk in community. You know, this is where I don't think that it's an individual decision about whether or not I should do things like change jobs or the like. I think God has called us into community, and oftentimes I want to talk to people. You know, I want to surround myself with people who I will trust if they tell me I am wrong. I may not find them at work. I may find them at church. I got to seek those people out. But who in your life has permission to tell you, I think you're making a mistake here, and that you will believe them? I regularly hear people tell me, oh yeah, lots of people tell me I'm making mistakes as they blow them off. No, I mean, who in your life has that authority? Because if that person has the authority and will regularly tell you if you're making a mistake, they will also have the credibility to tell you, I think it's time. I think it's time for move. I think it's whatever. You will now trust them because they're not just going to automatically take your side. What would you like to, is there one more question you want to ask?
There's many more questions. I'll do one
then
more.
Let's go with the questions.
And you can decide.
I've got lots of stuff I can say, but I'd rather hear your questions.
These are very good questions, actually. I think tee you up for probably where you're going anyway. George asked a question that I think is actually really critical. There's studies on burnout, studies on even like the millennial generation is now like dubbed the burnout generation. There's all this like exhaustion when it comes to work, and therefore when it comes to vocation. And George asked, how do we discern the level, like how much or the level to go for the people entrusted to our care? Like we only have a limited amount of time, and that rhythm that you speak of between labor and rest really does feel critical to the overall makeup of as humans. How do we know how to set limits there?
So there's two answers to that question. I'll give throw in a third one. Your idea about burnout, I was just listening to a podcast that Brene Brown did last week with the author of a new book on burnout. And I was so impressed with the book that I ordered it. And I'm looking at it over here. I was going to reach for it. Can't quite reach for it. And it's creatively titled Burnout. I found the podcast so impressive that I'm going to read the book. I can't recommend the book yet. I haven't read it. It arrived yesterday. But so if that's something you're interested in, I'll point to that. But I have two answers to you from a Christian perspective. One is take Sabbath seriously. What I mean by take Sabbath seriously is a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. Oftentimes when I hear people talking about how exhausting other human beings are, it's because the rest that they engage in is not restorative. And so they experience other people as cumulative. Can I use this term, cumulative annoyance? I mean, if I find people annoying and then I just have to pile up how annoying they are. Well, every human being that you encounter is going to at some point be annoying. I mean, that's just part of what it means to be human. And part of the reason Sabbath is so powerful is that it allows us to rest, to be restored so that we can counter all these other kinds of things. So the first thing I would ask is that if I have something overwhelming, I want to be sure to pay attention to how do I make sure I have restorative rest and not junk food rest. But then the other thing is, am I doing this in community? Doing it in community means that I have other people that are along the way. Oftentimes, I see people who are try to be superheroes who stand above everyone else. Almost everything I read in scripture is about we have communal relationships and even communal callings. It's hard for me to think about my calling as a professor apart from my calling of working with other colleagues who are professors. It would be overwhelming for me to imagine how to do the work with my students if I didn't have others to count on. I can do this part because I'm trusting other people to do their parts. If we are only working on our own, I think we have probably missed the idea of vocation.
That's great. There's a couple questions actually that sort of go to the place of the role of self-reflection. So I'll tee them both up for you, and you can go where you want, Scott. So Chris asked, in this framework that places people entrusted to my care at the center of vocational discernment, what role should self-awareness play? And then Bethany asked, are there signs or flags to know that we've missed something or we haven't listened well to those people who are entrusted to our care, and that we're over here doing this other thing when really this is what they need?
So I'm going to answer those questions separately because I have two different answers. So I'm going to get so caught up in answering Chris's question, I'm going to forget Bethany's, and your job is to keep me back on track. Remind me of Chris's question now.
If a discerning vocation is all about people entrusted to our care, what's the role of self-reflection in that?
Okay. So I would argue that there are three, what I jokingly call three selves, three habits of discernment that you have to engage in. Every human being, every Christian leader. And they are self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-discipline. Self-awareness is about the present. And it's how my emotions are affecting me and how my emotions are affecting everyone in the room and how other people's emotions are interacting with my emotions. So self-awareness is about the present. Self-reflection is about the past, being able to look back in the past and see what I have to learn, what I've done well, what I've done poorly. Oftentimes self-reflection has to take place in community because I'm going to miss stuff. That's going to be partially the answer to Bethany's question. So self-reflection is about the past, but self-discipline is about the future, about my ability to be able to decide I'm going to be different when future comes around. And one of my favorite phrases is, well, there's two phrases that go together. They're two sides of the same coin. One is preparation makes you agile. The other is a quote from athletics that says champions are made in the off season. And what I mean by that is the idea that self-discipline starts now. I engage in self-reflection, I decide how I want to be different, and I plan for how I'm going to be different, so that when I come into a situation, I actually am enacting a plan I've already thought through. If I have to invent the plan in the moment, I'm almost always going to fail. But if I have a clear plan, then I can move forward. Now, remind me of Bethany's question.
Yeah, I think building off of that, and then maybe even going back to the we are in community and even usages of the word your. Is it your singular or your plural? Here's where I'll go with Bethany's. Are there signs or red flags to know that you've missed something, that you haven't listened well to the people entrusted? And now I'm going to add quotes, your care, because I think that speaks to the communal nature that you were hinting at earlier.
So one of the things that I would argue is, I talked about who do we listen to, how do we listen, what do we listen for, and how do we listen well? The whole section on how to listen well is about empathy. And I think empathy is the key to this answer. Empathy is about feeling with someone. If Michaela were to be talking to me about something and I were to hear it, I wouldn't just acknowledge it. I would have to go into myself and find that feeling that she's talking about. Say she's angry at her boss. And I may not be angry at her boss or angry at my boss, but I know what it's like to be angry and hurt. And I need to actually go to the point where I feel angry and hurt with her. Sympathy is what I feel when you talk to me about your pain. I may find that inconvenient. I might find all this, all that. Empathy is feeling whatever you're feeling with you. And what I would argue in answer to Bethany's question is that we listen in order to be transformed. I need to be transformed with empathy by what I hear. And when I am transformed by empathy, I can't ignore the longings and losses of my people because I am feeling them with them. And so if my current answer isn't answering their question, if my current way of being isn't satisfactory, then I'm just going to keep groping to answer and work on it. I'm never going to be satisfied with it because I feel their pain. I feel their pain with them. And as I feel with them, it pulls me forward. So I can't just simply say, I tried and I can move on now. Any last question, or are we about out of time?
I would love to do one last question because I think it's going to let you put a punctuation mark on it. And Max has been patient since 10:22 a.m. So many of us have jobs where we're not like the sole leader with a bunch of people entrusted to our care. We work on teams. We work with bosses like you just described. How do we effectively manage up when we feel like we've got responsibility for people, but not necessarily authority as leaders?
So what you have asked is called the middle manager's dilemma. When I used to teach in Drucker School at the MBA program there, it is the question that came up most. And the name of the middle manager's dilemma is this, is I have more responsibility than I have authority. I don't have the authority to accomplish what I have responsibility for. And here is the big lie that most people believe. The big lie that most people believe is the solution to the middle manager's dilemma is I need more authority. Yet the things that matter most to you, you can never have enough authority. Can you ever have enough authority to make your workers fruitful and productive? Well, you can have enough authority to tell them what to do, but anyone who's ever parented teenagers understands there is a big difference between telling people, having the authority to tell somebody what to do, and actually getting them to be fruitful and productive. And so most of the things that matter most to you, you don't have the authority for. There has to be an alternative way. And what that is that we cultivate an environment to help people thrive, and then we hand them over to God. And so one of the things that Ronald Heifetz talks about is what are you authorized to do? So if you're on a team, you can do your part of the team. And yes, you can manage up. We can talk about that, about how you can activate questions for your boss and those kinds of things. But ultimately, it may well be that you don't have the authority. Well, let's go back to Mike, the store manager. Mike, the store manager, was working very hard to make people productive. And the corporation that he worked for needed to boost its short-term stock price for Wall Street reasons. And they made a bunch of decisions that were bad for his employees. They cut hours so that people wouldn't have benefits. They reneged on promised promotions. They cut out promised perks that they were going to put in. They did a bunch of things that were not enabling him to exercise his calling. And he asked this question, should I just leave my job? And his pastor told him, yeah, you should just become a minister, because that's the only place where you can really exercise a pristine vocation. I would disagree with that minister, respectfully. I would say, no, you stick on there and you are with your employees in their difficulty. What's the last thing Jesus said to us? Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus did not promise to take away our pain. Jesus promised to be with us in our pain. So the last image I'm going to leave for you is an image from 2 Corinthians, where it talks about how we are Christ's ambassadors. What's an ambassador? An ambassador is a citizen of one country who goes to live in another country with the express purpose of making good relations between the two. You are a citizen of heaven who temporarily resides as a citizen of this earth with the express purpose of creating good relations between the two. You are ambassador assigned to work in your workplace, and you are encouraged to be an ambassador in all the ways you can, but you cannot take the pain away. You cannot take away all the ways in which it's hard to work for your company, but you can work alongside people, and you can be with them in their pain, and you can point them to Jesus. And that's about all any of us can ask for.
Well, Scott, with that commission, everybody, you can sort of know why we love having Scott with us so much, and all the wisdom. And I really do encourage you to check out his book. It's this stuff and a lot more of it, and a lot more to dig into. We're just really grateful for you joining us here today. Lots more to be found on depree.org. And just, Scott, a special thank you to you. Thanks for helping us unpack this complicated topic of vocation.
My pleasure.